Hello, I'm Bob Weeks for Wichita Liberty TV, your weekly source for news, analysis, and commentary about Wichita and Kansas government and politics. We're broadcast on KGPT, also its companion website, kgpt26.com. On today's show, my guest is Dave Trabert, the president of Kansas Policy Institute. KPI is an independent, nonprofit organization that advocates for free enterprise solutions and the protection of personal freedom. KPI says its work is focused on state and local economic issues in Kansas with particular emphasis on education, fiscal policy, and health care. KPI empowers citizens and legislators with credible research and creative ideas to promote a low-tax, pro-growth environment that preserves the ability to provide high-quality services. Now, my interview with Dave Trabert, president of Kansas Policy Institute. We're well into this year's session in the Kansas legislature, and I know Kansas Policy Institute is involved, providing a lot of testimony, both you and your colleagues there. Am I right in thinking the biggest story this year is the adoption of the block grant bill for K through 12 education funding, not only because K through 12 schools account for about half of the state's general funding, but also the block grants is quite a departure from the old way, or still the present way of funding schools. Is that about right?
Yeah, I think it is. It has been the biggest issue so far this year.
Mm-hmm. So the block grants are, I think, confusing to some people who don't keep up as well as some people do. What does the block grant mean? How does it replace the existing way of paying for schools?
Well, basically, there is a lot of confusion over it, and I think unnecessarily so. The block grants were set up based on the old formula. Mm-hmm. So whatever districts were getting this year was based on what they were supposed to get this year, and with including all the weightings and so forth. Mm-hmm. So those functions are baked in. Now, some people have said, well, it doesn't have any weightings. Well, that's not exactly true, because the foundation of the grant was what they would have gotten this year under mm-hmm. the formula. And the difference is that the money, well, there's two differences. One is that it's called a block grant because they've taken away some of the silos. Now, so there's still money baked in for at-risk and mm-hmm. bilingual and so forth, because that was part of what they were getting this year. But the silos have been taken down. So districts, if they get more, which happens quite frequently, they get more than they need to provide a certain service. So now they can take that money and spend it on something else, mm-hmm. Whether it's money that's been dedicated or not in the past, or money that's even in some cases in their capital outlay funds. So they have a lot more flexibility to use the funds as they see fit.
Mm-hmm. Now, the old formula was pretty complicated, and it starts out with something called base state aid. And that number has actually gone down in recent years, but base state aid is just the start. For example, the school year that ended last summer, base state aid was about $3,800, but the weightings you spoke about drove total state spending to $7,088. So total state spending was 1.85 times base state aid. And we've seen over the years, through research you've done and others, that number has risen quite rapidly. I looked it up 10 years ago from last school year. The ratio of total state spending to base state aid was 1.24. Now it's 1.85. Mm-hmm. Talk about some of the weightings that go into that and why it's perhaps good that the block grant funding has taken those away, or at least not prescribed them as directly.
Right. One of the misnomers of a weighting is that in theory it provides additional money for funding for low income kids mm-hmm. or for bilingual.
So that at-risk funding, I believe, is 45.6%. I think that's the biggest of the
right.
weightings. So if a school can get a student to say we're below a certain level of income, not only do they get the free school lunches or reduced cost lunches, but then the school district gets the extra 45%.
Right. The school district gets extra money. And in theory, that money is supposed to go to that child. But that's not what happens. It happens in some cases, but an awful lot of the money is just spent proportionally. So let's say if you have a classroom of 20 kids and there are 5 at-risk students in there, then 25% of the money, of the cost of that classroom, can be covered with at-risk funds. It doesn't mean that those children who are at risk in that classroom got any special service. They're just present. And so some of the at-risk money can be used for that. At-risk money can also be used for kindergarten. So it's one thing to say that there's these weightings, and so when districts say that there's not weightings that will change over the time, so the weightings are baked in, but it's a block grant that's going to grow a little bit each year. Their concern is that, well, if we get more at-risk kids, we're not going to get extra money for it. Well, that's true, but they're not necessarily spending all that money on those at-risk kids now. The other thing is that school districts do have a lot of options, even though their weightings might not go up. They have a lot of money in the bank they can pull down. They have carryover cash reserves that across the state started this year at $857 million.
So that's money that the state has, well, maybe it came from other sources besides the state, but it's money that the schools had as revenue, but they chose not to spend for one reason or another.
That's exactly right. Over the course of time, those funds, it's state and local funds, so it's all taxpayer money that was given to educate students in prior years, and it grew from $458 million to $857 million between 2005 and 2014. So they can use some of that money. They can also choose to stop wasting money. I sat on the K-12 Commission last fall, and we heard, in addition to legislative post-audit, confirming that every one of their audits had found schools to be operating inefficiently. And by the way, they said many of their recommendations were ignored because they were just voluntary. They were recommendations. We also heard from school districts and from the State School Board Association.
Hold on to that thought for a minute about the Efficiency Commission, because we need to take a moment for a commercial break. When we come back, we'll talk about school efficiency spending. What did the Efficiency Commission find out? Welcome back to Wichita Liberty TV. I'm Bob Weeks, and with me this week, Dave Trabert of Kansas Policy Institute. So you mentioned this K-12 School Efficiency Commission. This is something I believe the legislature created, and you and others served on that. What did that commission find? And I think that you and some others found something a little different because there was a minority report. Is that right?
Right. The minority report pointed out a number of things that we felt. I was one of the members signing that minority report, and we felt that were very important that the full commission couldn't reach agreement on. One of them was the fact that schools don't understand how to define and measure the Rose standards. School districts and the State School Board Association came in asking us to recommend to the legislature that they help them reach a definition of what the Rose standards mean and how to measure that.
Now, the Rose standards are something I think that entered through last year's school finance decision. Is that what the Kansas Supreme Court has said that Kansas schools need to aim for?
Right. The Supreme Court ruling in Gannon said when the lower court said schools were underfunded. The Supreme Court said the lower court used the wrong test. That it's not supposed to be based on base state aid or a cost study or total spending. It's supposed to be based, first of all, on whether students have the opportunity to meet or exceed the Rose standards. And so what we found out from the school districts and the School Board Association was openly admitting that they don't know how to do that. What that told us, several of us on the commission, was that if they don't know how to measure what they're supposed to meet or exceed, then they don't seem to have a legal basis for claiming they lack funding to get there. If you can't identify the target, how do you say you don't have enough money to reach the target?
And I think there was some confusion also. There was an anecdote or something where school districts said, well, you want us to operate more efficiently. What if we let go this librarian? Have we become more efficient if we've done that?
No, they have not. And that's another thing we pointed out, that schools, some districts don't seem to understand what efficiency really means. cutting a librarian, if it's needed, is not being more efficient. That's just cutting a budget. Efficiency is providing the same or better quality service at a better price. So whether it's in the classroom or outside the classroom, how do we do what we're doing at a better price? That's the goal of efficiency. And we found that legislative post-audit testified that every one of their audits had found schools to be inefficient operators. And they also said that many of their recommendations had been ignored. We even had school districts acknowledge that in some cases, yes, they could spend less, but they just didn't want to. Now, they may have classified that as for reasons of local control, or the staff didn't want to, or they wanted to support local merchants. But however they justify it, the consequence of that decision is to divert money from instruction. They're spending more than they needed to provide a certain service, and by doing so, they took money away from instruction. So that's another, going back to the block grant, these are options that school districts have at their disposal. They could stop choosing to spend more money than necessary in some places. They could consolidate with other districts outside their district boundaries on some of the administrative functions, the transportation and the purchasing and the warehousing. A little bit of that's being done, but not near enough.
I think there were some serious problems, too. There was a legislative post-audit just this week of a fairly small district in extreme northeastern Kansas. In 2013, it says the district's payroll clerk was caught embezzling $35,000 because of inadequate separation of duties or financial controls. And they still have that problem. And it also said for the same district, for direct deposit payroll, the preparer could add an additional payment to himself and no one would detect it. So those seem to be some severe problems. And I think your 5-year budget plan that we talked about last year also noted that if the payrolls in schools are a problem because we can't document how we could get some reimbursement from the federal government.
Right. Basically, the issue is that many school district payrolls are not sophisticated enough to capture the cost of CAPERS, the pension, the retirement program, for employees who are performing federally funded services, such as special education or meal provision. You can bill the federal government for the full cost of providing those services, but you have to be able to document it on a case-by-case basis. And because Kansas can't do that, and largely because a lot of school districts don't want to change, they don't want to outsource their payroll to places where it could be done, Kansas loses about $20 million a year in federal reimbursement.
So that's not a huge amount of money, but it's quite a bit, I mean, in the total picture. So we have, you mentioned CAPERS, the Kansas State Public Employee Retirement Program. That factors into the school finance debate a lot because a lot of the schools, people in favor of more school spending say, well, that increase, that was just CAPERS. It doesn't really go into the classroom. So this whole idea of classroom, they also say, no, that was bond and interest spending. That doesn't really go into the classroom, ignoring that it pays for the actual classroom.
Right.
These type of things. Will some of these arguments kind of fade away with the block grants, or will they still be something we have to argue about?
I imagine that argument will still be made, and it's largely a disingenuous argument, I think. It's interesting that when school districts are promoting a bond issue, that they'll say that these new buildings are essential part of education, but when they don't want them to count when they're being held accountable for all the spending.
Because most of those school buildings are built with borrowed money, so year after year there's bond payments, principal and interest both.
Right. On the subject of CAPERS, yes, the CAPERS spending has gone up. The money required to go into CAPERS has gone up. Of course, part of the reason it's gone up is because schools have hired more employees. And so there's going to be an increased cost there. But even if you take out CAPERS, CAPERS funding makes up only about 5% of total school funding, which this year, even with the block grants, are expected to set a brand new record of $6.147 billion.
Hold on to that thought again, Dave, because we're up against a commercial break. So I'm Bob Weeks this week with Dave Trabert of Kansas Policy Institute. We'll be back in just a moment. Welcome back to Wichita Liberty TV. I'm Bob Weeks, and this week my guest is Dave Trabert of Kansas Policy Institute. So we were talking about the block grants, and I think you wanted to bring up the fact that school spending is still going up, and the number of teachers has been rising for the past 4 years too.
Right. A lot of the media reports and school district statements have focused on the fact that they're not getting as much of an increase as they want. They call it a cut, but that's that's government speak for not getting to spend more than they want to spend. The reality is that even with the block grants, spending is going to set another new record this year at $6.147 billion on a per pupil basis. That's $13,347.
So both in absolute dollars and then dollars per student both go up, and that money is from state, federal, and local funding.
That's
to
all
be sure.
funding, and as the Supreme Court says, all funding should count when you're looking at whether schools are adequately funded.
But as we see, the school spending lobby wants to focus on that $3,800 base state aid number, and really they want us to. In some of the surveys we've seen, even ones done by your organization and others nationwide, most people think schools spend only about $4,000 per year, something in that neighborhood.
Well, and that's understandable because that's what a lot of schools claim. We know that's not true, that they actually receive, many of them in addition, in excess of $13,000 per pupil. The base state aid is only a small piece of it, and that's part of the reason I think that the Supreme Court said that you can't just look at one piece of funding or even one segment like is what comes from the state. You have to look at all of the funding because it all counts.
Now the block grants, that bill's been passed by the Senate and the House, and now it's on the governor's desk. Presumably he'll sign it because he called for block grants in his State of the State address. So this program is just for 2 years, and during those 2 years, I guess the plan is for the legislature and others to come up with a new school formula to replace the old one. Do you have any thoughts about what that formula should include?
Well, I think we start by looking at what's wrong with the current formula. One of the things that's wrong is that it's, the school funding formula, the purpose of it is to educate students, to make sure that they have the opportunity for getting a good education. Outcomes are really not considered in the development of this formula. In fact, one of the things reason I think it's broken is that it's producing the outcomes it's producing are far too low in many cases. So I think there needs to be some accountability built in, not just to see that there's funding and have it theoretically be to produce outcomes, but to actually make sure that it does, to hold schools accountable for some of the outcomes. I think we found from every study that's looked at school funding, every legislative post-audit, even their own admissions, indicates that they're not making efficient use of taxpayer money. So I think somehow that needs to be built in, where there needs to be a requirement that schools will make efficient, effective use of whatever funds they're provided. And it needs to be transparent. It needs to be very clear how much is being spent.
And what do we do to schools that either are wasting money or not producing good student outcomes? What do we do with those?
Well, there's a lot of different ways to do that. If you have students, districts that aren't producing sufficient. Now, certainly there are a lot of students now, and I'm sure going into the future, who will continue to get a very good public education. And that's great, but we can't ignore the fact that thousands of kids every year are left behind. That's one of the reasons that we think this formula is irreparably broken. I'll give you an example. The 2014 graduating class, according to the ACT, only 31% of students in Kansas are college ready in English, reading, math, and science.
Yeah.
Now, if you look at that, you break down, unpack that, 36% of white students are college ready. Only 14% of Hispanic students are college ready, and only 7% of African American students. These numbers haven't changed that much.
And when we look, I know things like we've both done the research on like the National Assessment of Educational Progress scores. We see the same thing, that Kansas white students do relatively well, but minority students not very well at all in some cases.
That's right. It's fourth grade reading, for example. Only 38% of all Kansas fourth graders are proficient in reading on the National Assessment of Educational Progress. If you look at it as low-income and not low-income kids, the low-income kids are almost 3 years worth of learning behind their peers. In the fourth grade, they're almost 3 years worth of learning behind.
So that means
You're
they
not
really
going to catch up.
Yeah, they really can barely read. Then I guess we're saying they read at a first grade level.
They're three. You could maybe say that they're almost 3 years worth of learning behind, according to the National Assessment of Educational Progress. So, one of the things that points out is that putting more money, for example, into early childhood. Nobody disagrees that early childhood isn't beneficial. The problem is when you put those kids into a system that isn't working, the benefits of that disappear pretty quickly.
Mm-hmm. And I think there even have been some studies showing that the Head Start provided really little benefit at all. So, and that is, of course, a big problem. It's not the kids' fault. I mean, we can't hold the kids accountable, really. It's the schools and, unfortunately, sometimes the parents.
Well, and some of that goes back to accountability. Mm-hmm. There is no consequence for schools not producing the necessary results. And part of that, and this is another part of the formula that I think needs to be addressed, is we don't fund students. The purpose of education is to improve students' learning. Mm-hmm. We fund institutions, though, in Kansas. So the money goes to the district. It doesn't necessarily go to the student who needs another service. It goes to the district. It might not even get to the building. Mm-hmm. We have to change so that we're funding students rather than funding institutions in Kansas.
Well, these are just some of the reasons why school funding is, doesn't really have to be, but it is a complicated thing. Certainly it's contentious, first of all, because it's a lot of money, but then there's a lot of different interests all pulling at the same pile of money. So, Dave Trabert, we certainly appreciate you being involved as Kansas Policy Institute and being involved in this fight. Thanks for appearing on Wichita Liberty TV. So that's it for this week. I'm Bob Weeks for Wichita Liberty TV.